and I'm a cataloger. That's what I was looking for. I'm the Technical Services Librarian at the College of DuPage in Glen Ellen, which is about 35 miles southwest of here. I'm a member of the MentorNet Steering Committee, and I was the incoming chair of the Illinois OCLC Users Group in 2010. Get a little history from the bylaws so you can kind of get a perspective about our organization. The Illinois OCLC's Users Group, or IOUG, whose tagline was, "Working for better library service since 1976. It was founded to promote the use of the OCLC database, which now obviously we call WorldCat, and related Illinois OCLC services for libraries and educational institutions in Illinois for educational, literacy, scientific, go figure, and research purposes. IOUG's primary purpose was the training and continuing education programs for Illinois OCLC users and to serve as a vehicle for organized input and communication concerning OCLC among the users of OCLC and the Illinois OCLC programs that were contained in the Illinois State Library. So in 2009, OCLC changed its structure and governance, and they created the OCLC Training Portal, which became their gateway to OCLC products and services and the access to instruction from OCLC and OCLC certified training partners. So this resulted in the loss of the administrative, the accounting, the coordination, and the planning support for the Illinois OCLC programs that were contained in the Illinois State Library. And that's what IOUG sort of counted on. IOUG was the grassroots organization which now had, after this incident, to deliberate on how to continue to be viable, to meet the needs of its membership within the framework now of a standalone volunteer organization. At our last board retreat in 2009, a temporary mission statement was crafted. We foster excellence in Illinois libraries through expert mentoring and training in cataloging and technical services, and a new name, MentorNet, Mentoring Networking, was created. A small but mighty band of former IOUG members agreed to act as a steering committee and determine the fate of our organization. In these past few years, a handful of training sessions were delivered by volunteer trainers from across the state. We did staff a booth at an ILA conference a couple years ago, and we developed a short-lived web presence in Plinkett, so some of you might have picked that up on that. The overwhelming sentiment, however, that we got from these sessions was that training is very important and necessary, but with slimmer staffing, beyond tight budgets, and ubiquitous internet, virtual training really has become a more viable option for most. So here we are today. This is most likely our last formal activity for MentorNet, the former Illinois OCLC Users Group, and we're really delighted to have this opportunity to give back to the membership. I believe, if I remember right, the last dues were like $25 a year, so over the years that's built up our treasury a little bit. This gives back to our member libraries and to the Illinois community. Over 70% now, as I counted, of you in this room are actually former IOUG members, or your libraries were. So this session, for those of us who can't join us today, is being taped, hence all the extra mics and things, and it'll be later posted on the ILA website as well as other various cataloging websites so that your colleagues can and you can continue to review what you had as well as the speaker's handouts. So when RDA was rolled out this year, we seized this relevant and timely opportunity to bring this training to you, and we're really fortunate to have Adam Schiff and Bobby Bothmann join us for a full day of RDA. We tweaked the schedule just a little bit, realizing that many more of you are probably book catalogers than AV catalogers, and also because Adam had way more slides than Bobby. So we're going to cover the catalog in the first session from about 10 to 12:30. We'll have a little break in there for restrooms. Then we have lunch, which will actually be upstairs, up the escalators, in a buffet style, and you can pick and choose what you're interested in. Then Adam will continue his session for another half hour from 1:30 to 2. And then Bobby will start the AV cataloging session from 2 to 3. Another break, so we're going to feed you well and hydrate you well. And we'll continue the session from 3:30 to 4:30. The workbooks that you got when you walked in the door contain their slides. May not get through absolutely every one of them, but then you'll be able to follow and take notes. And if you will, consider these your sort of RDA executive summaries. Since if you have actually seen the real RDA in print, it's pretty hefty. Before I close, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our original steering committee. Some of them are in the room today. Joy Anhalt, Lynette Donahue, Linda McEwen, Anita Morgan, Donna Schall, Suzanne Schreier, Shelley Stone, and Ann Craig, and the wonderful folks at the Illinois State Library. A special thanks to Cindy Robinson and the ILA staff for arranging this wonderful venue. And I really could not have done it as a single person without their support. So, even though the letters RDA are in the word Armageddon, you catalogers and technical services staff from various library types from all across the state of Illinois have come together to witness that, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, a dramatic and catastrophic conflict, especially one seen as likely to destroy the world or the human race, will truly be avoided. I'd now like to introduce Adam Schiff. He is Principal Cataloger at the University of Washington Libraries in Seattle, Washington. He served as chair as one of the 2 RDA example groups that supplied the original set of examples that were found in RDA. He's chaired the Elect CCS Committee on Cataloging, Description and Access, CCDA, and the Machine Readable Bibliographic MARB Committee, and currently chairs the Elect Subject Analysis Committee's Genre Form Subcommittee. He is the author of the SACO Participants Manual and is trainer for NACO and instructor for several courses on the Catalogers Learning Workshop. Please join me in welcoming Adam, and we're going to switch the mics. Just give us a second.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to come back to Illinois and talk about RDA again. I see some faces in the audience from the last time I was here in Bolingbrook at Laconia a couple years ago. And for those of you who were at that presentation at Laconia, some of this will look familiar because what I've basically done is taken some of that presentation and updated it because a lot has changed over the last couple of years, added new things to it as well. So it's not identical, but some of it will look familiar if you have handouts from that presentation a couple of years ago. Yes. Yes. We've got index cards in front of each of the places you're sitting, and we've decided in the interest of time that if you have questions, write them down, because we can easily get waylaid with me taking questions from the floor, and I have a lot of slides, and we're not sure that I can even get through all of my slides, but I wanted you to have all the handouts in case we don't. So Mary's going to collect the slides, and if we have time, we'll answer questions. If not, she's going to get the questions to us, and we'll answer them for you if they're not already answered, and she'll distribute that, I guess, online. I also want to point out at the web address on this first slide, you can get this presentation, including my notes. So if you don't have, if you already have the slides, but if you actually want to see my speaker's notes, I have, you can get the PowerPoint slides, or you can get a PDF that I made, which includes my notes. So just go to that website and scroll down to the bottom where the latest version of this talk on RDA is, and you'll find them there. Okay. I want to talk, we'll talk a little bit, how many of you have seen RDA itself? Most of you have seen it, so that's good. How many of you are subscribing to the toolkit? A good portion of you, okay. So then most of you already know that RDA is basically an online product that is delivered through something called the RDA Toolkit. There is a print version, but RDA is updated pretty much every month online, and the print version is a static product that is not kept up to date. Also, RDA allows you to jump between sections of the rules real easily in the toolkit, which you couldn't do in a paper version. And the paper version is really not the way that you really want to use to learn RDA. But if that's, it's a lot cheaper than subscribing, so some of you may decide you just want to order the paper version. I don't know that they're...
In press as we speak, because I inquired about whether or not we could get copies. So you should be able to put in pre-press orders right now.
Yeah, I mean, we have, when ALA published a print version of RDA, when it first came out, I don't know, but I don't know if they're keeping it up to date and loose leaf.
This one will be up through the July 2013, and then I guess you'll have to subscribe to the loose leaf update.
So thank you. So just a little bit about the structure of RDA. If you look at the table of contents, you'll see an introduction, and then you have the specific instructions. And in RDA, instead of AACR2, we were calling these things rules. For some reason, they've decided that we're calling them instructions in RDA. So you'll have specific instructions, and RDA is organized very differently than AACR2 is. So hopefully you're familiar with FRBR, the Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records, which is an international model that has come out to describe various types of entities that libraries collect and that are associated with things that libraries collect. So RDA is organized by these FRBR group entities. Group 1 is chapters 1 to 7, and those are the things that are works, expressions, manifestations, and items. And if those terms are not familiar to you, you need to become familiar with those terms: work, expression, manifestation, and item. And then we have chapters for FRBR Group 2 entities, which are the persons, families, and corporate bodies associated with the Group 1 entities. And then we have one chapter devoted to, there's a section devoted to the Group 3 entities, which are the subjects of works. But the only one that is actually in RDA right now is the one dealing with place. The others are concept, object, and event. And there's some talk about revising the way that section will eventually appear in RDA. And then there's a whole section of chapters devoted to relationships. So RDA places a lot of emphasis on relationships. And we'll look at that in some of our slides as well. Then finally you have appendices just like you had in AACR2, a glossary, and an index. Just a screenshot from the RDA Toolkit. Since most of you have it, you're familiar with what this looks like. This was just a screenshot of the introduction. And I just want to remind and emphasize that it's not organized like AACR2. It's not by class of materials. There are no separate chapters for books, maps, music, sound recordings, video, etc. They have tried to organize it in such a way that all of the principles that apply to every type of resource are in the main part of the instructions, and then if there are specific instructions that only apply to one type of resource, like videos or serials, then those will be identified with some kind of labeling that they're an exception or, for that particular type of material. The other thing is that they're organized, the overarching principle is that they're organized around the goals or tasks to help users identify and relate the resources they need from our collections. Another one of those things that has become really common is the find, identify, select, and obtain objectives of the catalog. And so RDA is organized around helping users identify and also relate. So if you have one resource, is it related to other things that they might be interested in, or how is it related in some way? And then each element in RDA is addressed separately. And so when you look at RDA, you'll have examples of, well, for example, the title proper, the statement of responsibility, the addition statement, and so on. Each of those is considered a separate element, and you'll have instructions for each of those. And sometimes you even have sub-elements. And then you have instructions in some of the chapters for how to assemble those bits of elements together to form what's called an authorized access point, which is what we used to call in AACR2 a heading. So some of the RDA elements are designated as core elements, and the assignment of core status is based on attributes mandatory for a national level record, as documented in the FRBR and FRAD, which is the authority data model that goes along with FRBR, as documented in those FRBR and FRAD models. So coreness, when something is core in RDA, that means it's required, if appropriate and applicable. And then we also have certain things that are labeled what we call core if. So they're not necessarily core unless a certain situation is applicable. For example, the name of the distributor is not core unless you don't have the name of the publisher. So if you don't know the name of the publisher, then if you know the name of the distributor, that becomes core and must be recorded in your record. So the core elements are listed as a group in RDA 0.6, and then they're also separately in the appropriate chapters of RDA. And then the Library of Congress and the PCC, the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, have identified additional elements as what they call either LC core or PCC core, or some cases they agree and they call it LC PCC core. And those, each individual library could decide to make certain things core that are not core in RDA. So if you decide, for example, dimensions of a book is not a core element, the dimensions is not a requirement, but you may decide that you always want to record the dimensions and you will make it core for your library. So here's just a screenshot of some of the instructions from RDA showing how these things are labeled. So you can see that title proper is a core element. Statement of responsibility is a core element. So if everything you catalog must have a title proper, right? There must be a title. So obviously that's clear why that's a core element. Statement of responsibility is a core element, and you notice that sometimes there are some sentences below that give you the situation that is appropriate and they describe. So what is core is the statement of responsibility relating to the title proper is core. Distribution, as I mentioned, is a core element, but it's only a core element when you don't have the corresponding publication information. Copyright date is a new element different from publication date, and it is a core element, but only when you don't have the date of publication or the date of distribution. So you kind of have these cascading effects sometimes in RDA. And series statement is a core element. As I mentioned, dimensions is not a core element. You don't see the word core next to the instruction for dimensions. But the Library of Congress has decided that it would make it a core element. And the Library of Congress, as you can see, there's a little symbol next to dimensions that says LC PCC PS, which PS stands for policy statement. These are the equivalent of the Library of Congress rule interpretations that we had with AACR2. And you can see if there is a policy statement for any particular instruction in RDA, there's a little button there, and you click on it, and what comes up is what you see at the bottom of the screen, and it tells us that dimensions is a core element for Library of Congress for resources other than serials and online e-resources. Layout is another example of something that isn't a core element, and you can see in this case we also have a policy statement, and you notice that in this case it's labeled as a core element for both LC and the Program for Cooperative Cataloging. Okay, just a little bit about the structure of RDA, and particularly about alternatives, options, and exceptions. RDA designates a number of guidelines and instructions as these alternatives, options, or exceptions, and all of them are clearly labeled as such in the toolkit by the presence of a green vertical bar in the left margin and a green legend in the instruction that says alternative. The alternative guidelines and instructions provide, obviously, an alternative to what is specified in the immediately preceding instruction. Optional instructions provide for either the optional addition of data that supplement what is called for in the immediately preceding instructions, or the optional omission of specific data called for in that preceding instruction. And then we have exceptions as well, and some of those are scoped as being applicable to only certain types of resources, such as serials or moving images. Whether to apply the alternatives, options, or exceptions is left to cataloger judgment unless a particular practice has been identified in a Library of Congress PCC policy statement. But again, each library or consortium, if you're working in a consortium, will need to decide if you're going to follow the Library of Congress's decisions or the PCC decisions, or whether you will leave it to cataloger judgment or make decisions on your own. And we're wrestling with that now. We actually haven't implemented RDA at my library for everyone, and we're going to have to convene our cataloging policy committee to talk about since we're a PCC member, we must follow the PCC decisions, but where it's left to cataloger's judgment, we have to decide what are we going to do. Do we want a uniform decision locally or in our consortium of 37 or 39 libraries in Idaho, Oregon, and Washington? So I don't know how easy this screenshot is able to be seen, but I think probably in your booklet it's pretty nice. But you can see examples of optional omissions and exceptions that are labeled in the RDA Toolkit. Okay, I've already mentioned, I'm not going to belabor this point because I've mentioned that little green icon for the policy statements. So in the toolkit you'll follow that. Now if you don't subscribe to the toolkit, you have no way of getting these policy statements. Actually I think they might be available in PDF on the Library of Congress website. So you could probably print them off and use them as a supplement to if you have just the printed RDA. A little bit about examples, since that's what I was really involved with the creation of RDA. They illustrate the specific instruction under which they appear. They're normally given without showing the preceding or enclosing punctuation. So when you see the examples, they're in a bubble. They're not in the form necessarily that they will look like in a MARC record, because we're not showing the MARC punctuation or the ISBD punctuation that comes before or after. The examples were constructed with the assumption that the cataloging agency is an English language agency. So notes are in English, for example, and examples of notes, they'll be in English. But if you're a library in Quebec, they would be using French language notes. And qualifiers added to distinguish entities would be in English, because it's an English language catalog is the assumption in RDA. And they will appear in yellow shading in boxes. Remember our AACR2 concept of chief source. You won't find the words chief source anymore in RDA. This has been replaced by the RDA concept of preferred sources. It's not only a change of term, but it also reflects RDA's expansion from a single source to multiple sources for information. The preferred source of information is still the source where you find the title proper. But for most elements, RDA gives you permission to take information from any source with the choices given in a priority order. Only when you're taking information from outside the resource entirely are we going to use square brackets. So this is a very different use of square brackets than in AACR2. As you recall, when you took the statement of responsibility from the verso of the title page, you had to put it in square brackets. That's not the case. You can actually take the statement of responsibility from any place in a book and from multiple places in a book without putting square brackets around any of it. There is still a priority order for which source you use to choose your title proper. And Though that information is found in 3 categories in RDA. So there's one category for when you have a resource that is in pages, leaves, etc., or images of pages, leaves, etc., like an online PDF of a book. Then we have instructions for moving images, and Bobby, I think, is probably going to talk about that. And then everything else. So maps would fall under that, and sound recordings would fall under that, and so on. There's an instruction for everything else. The one exception to the bracketing that I mentioned is that when you're cataloging a resource that doesn't typically have bibliographic information on it, for example, a photograph or a sculpture, you don't need, when you're making up or devising a title and putting that in there, you don't need to put that in square brackets in a case where you have a resource that normally wouldn't have any kind of bibliographic information on it. So let's look a little bit for books at the instruction that deals with the resources with pages, leaves, etc., or images of pages, leaves, etc. RDA has a priority order in 2.2.2.2. You all got that memorized now? As a principal cataloger, I was always able to cite a few ACR2 rule numbers off the top of my head. That's not as easy with RDA because it's all decimal numbers and they can get real long. And maybe I'll remember 2.2.2.2 because it's the same number. But we're living with these really unwieldy numbering in RDA. So the priority order for choosing the source for your title proper, your preferred source for a book would be the title page, title sheet, or title card, or an image of it. And the next preferred source is different from ACR2 because it's the cover or a jacket issued with the resource or image. And then if you don't have that, you'd go down to a caption if there is such a thing, or an image of it, followed by a masthead, and followed by a colophon. And then if none of these are present in the textual thing that you're cataloging, another source that has a title which you give preference to a source in which the information is formally presented. Most of the time you're going to have a title page, or you have some readily identifiable substitute for the title page, like the cover. Or I know for East Asian materials often you end up with a colophon and such. For serials you may have to use the masthead. Now there's an alternative for microform or digital resources. And that alternative says that you should use an iReadable label, or you can use the iReadable label instead of the image of the title page, title sheet, or title card. Now the Library of Congress has devised their own policy, and they have said that they will not apply this alternative for microforms. So instead of using the iReadable label for the microform, they're actually going to use the image of the title page. But they are going to apply this for direct access electronic resources such as CD-ROMs. So rather than opening up the CD-ROM and looking for a title screen in the CD-ROM, they're going to use the label, the disk label. I notice I labeled this LC practice. I don't know what, there is no defined PCC practice as of this point. Then we have instructions on resources issued in more than one part, such as serials or multi-part monographs, integrating resources, and kits. And this is in 2.1.2.3. And we're told that if these are sequentially numbered, use the lowest number issue or part available. If they are unnumbered or not sequentially numbered, use the issue or part with the earliest date of issue. And if the concept of sequential numbering is not appropriate, for example, a kit where you have a bunch of different parts, but they're not numbered in any way, use the resource as a whole. If this is not possible, generally determine the main part of that kit. (2.2.2.4) provides a priority order for the preferred sources for resources other than those in those first two categories. And it divides into tangible and online resources. So for tangible resources, an example would be a sound recording. It says use the first of these having a title, so a textual source on the resource itself, or a label printed or affixed to it, so like a disk label, an internal source such as the title screen, container or other accompanying material, or another source forming part of the resource where the information is formally presented. If instead of tangible you have an online resource, we use the first of these having a title, the textual content, embedded metadata in textual form that has a title, or another source forming part of the resource where the information is formally presented. Okay, so that's just a real quick overview, and when you're using RDA, you're going to want to reread these instructions and try to figure out how they apply to your particular resource. Now I'm going to skip over to general information about description. And a little bit about some principles that are different from AACR2 in some ways. And the first one is transcription practices. One of the practices, this slide and several of the others in my presentation, I've adapted from some LC training for RDA, that a module 1 that they use for their own staff. And they have this phrase, take what you see and accept what you get. And that's sometimes hard for us as catalogers to always just accept what we get, right? Because sometimes we don't get such good stuff in our cataloging. This comes from the Statement of International Cataloging Principles, in particular the principle of representation, where it says descriptions and controlled forms of names should be based on the way an entity describes itself. So what this means in practice is that in RDA we have transcribed elements and recorded elements, and when we're actually transcribing something, RDA places much greater emphasis on actually transcribing it the way it appears. Although it does give us some instructions about altering when necessary. So basically we don't alter punctuation when we're transcribing from a resource in RDA. AACR2 had very specific instructions that said if you have square brackets, that means a special thing, and you can't transcribe square brackets, so change them to parentheses in your title. In RDA, we're going to try to accurately represent the resource as it represents itself. One of the points of this is to encourage the reuse of found data. In other words, to allow libraries to be able to scan data from resources and capture them and just use the data as found, or to receive digital information from publishers about their publications without, and who often do not follow the capitalization rules that we have followed in AACR2. So it's to encourage reuse of data that you can copy and paste or scan and download into your description of the resource without having a cataloger have to alter a lot of it to conform to specific guidelines of punctuation and abbreviation. Now, along with this concept of take what you see, the RDA actually still does have instructions on capitalization, punctuation, diacritics, symbols, spacing of initials and acronyms, etc., etc., and what to do with typos, which we also have instructions for in AACR2. And there are appendices in RDA, just like there were in AACR2, for capitalization and for abbreviations and such. There is an alternative in RDA 1.71 which allows for using in-house guidelines or a published style manual. So you could say, instead of following RDA's capitalization punctuation guidelines, we in my library always follow the Chicago Manual of Style or some other style manual. We developed our own, and we're going to do that. RDA actually gives you the freedom to do that locally and still be creating RDA acceptable records. There is a policy statement from LCPCC for that alternative, which encourages catalogers but doesn't actually require following Appendix A for capitalization of transcribed elements. So if the title page of your book is all in capital letters, you actually can, within RDA, transcribe that in your MARC record in all capital letters. Even though RDA does say, follow the punctuation and capitalization guidelines in this appendix, and the appendix is basically the same as what we did in ACR2. So very little change there, actually. But it, in particular, allows for capturing or scanning data or cutting and pasting out of PDFs without having to change the capitalization. So that it's encouraging some efficiencies. Now, a lot of people don't like all caps, think it doesn't look so great, and but you will see, particularly during the RDA test of a few years ago, a lot of catalogers were experimenting with transcribing all caps, if that's the way it appeared, or the first letter of every word in the title, if it appeared in capitals, transcribing it that way, even though that's not how we would do it in ACR2 or according to the appendix in RDA. So you'll still see some catalogers are allowed, because of this policy statement, LC and PCC are saying that's still okay. You can take and copy it the way you see it, but they encourage us actually to follow the appendix, which is basically no change from ACR2. For punctuation, numerals, symbols, abbreviations, etc., the policy statement says to follow the RDA instructions. In terms of capitalization, RDA has an instruction that just says go to Appendix A and follow the capitalization there. And again, we have that first alternative in the policy statement about that alternative, which says for capitalization of transcribed elements, catalogers are encouraged but not required to follow Appendix A. It is permitted to take what you see on the resource. I think most catalogers are gone back to following Appendix A from what I see in RDA records, but I still see some what looks to me like unusual capitalization, which must reflect what's on the book or other item that the people are cataloging. So if you look at these two boxes, the first one reflects what actually appears on the title page. So Cairo in lowercase, upper and lowercase, but then the subtitle in all uppercase, and the addition statement in all uppercase. And you could transcribe that as you see it, and you will see records in OCLC like this. And if you see them, you'll have to decide, are you going to take the time to uncapitalize them for your local system because it's perfectly valid RDA? Or are you going to just leave it and accept it in your copy and just move on to the next book? The alternative, of course, in the second box is to do what Appendix A and what we've always done in ACR2, which is to take only the proper names and capitalize them in the first word and capitalize it, but most other words would be lowercase. For transcription of punctuation, numbers, symbols, abbreviations, etc., RDA gives us a whole bunch of instructions, but basically we're told to follow what's on the resource. So we don't alter, in most cases, punctuation, although RDA allows us to add punctuation for legibility if that need be, and ACR2 allowed us to do that as well. Just a little bit about the distinction between transcribed elements and recorded elements. So a transcribed element means you're taking it and recording it exactly as found. So you taking it, typing it exactly as you see it. For recorded elements, RDA will say record the ISBN, for example. Now, most of us see ISBNs and there's dashes between some of the digits. But in MARC, we omit those dashes and we just put the 13-digit ISBN number. This is a situation where we're recording the ISBN, not necessarily transcribing it as it appears on the resource. And we know that programs know where to put the hyphens when they print out or display the ISBN. They're smart enough to figure that out, which is why we never input them in our MARC records to begin with. A little bit about language and script. So RDA 1.4 says to transcribe in the language and script found in the resource. And then there's a list of elements to be transcribed. So the basic instruction for most elements for describing a manifestation, which is usually the book you have in your hand, is to transcribe that data. Take what you see, in other words. And then there are non-transcribed elements. And RDA tells us that when you're recording other elements, for example, the extent, number of pages, or notes about it, that you should record them in English, because the assumption is that it's an English-speaking, English language agency doing the cataloging. Of course, a library in Germany is going to record these in German. When you're adding data within an element, record it in the language and script of the element to which it is added. And when supplying an element, you would generally supply it in English. So for example, if the place of publication is not on the book, but you know what it is, or you're supplying a guess, you're going to say Munich and not München, because you're going to supply that element, generally supply it in English. Now, regarding non-Latin scripts, anybody catalog in foreign languages non-Latin? Not too many, okay. A couple, all right. LC policy is to record a transliteration. Now, the RDA says if you transcribe it the way it appears, so if you have Greek, RDA says you would record the Greek title, in Greek alphabet. Now, our policy in the U.S. has generally always been to transliterate that into Roman letters, or to give both. So we could transliterate it and then also give Greek. And for certain alphabets and scripts, there's a policy that you can only use languages and scripts in the MARC 8 repertoire of UTF-8, and those are the Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, Yiddish, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Cyrillic, and Greek alphabets. But OCLC now actually allows you to input Thai and some other scripts as well, Tamil, I think, and Sanskrit or Devanagari scripts. And there may be some others as well, I'm not sure. In OCLC, Library of Congress has said that if a library is authenticating a record of a monograph record, they can use whatever scripts are available in the system that they're using. Okay, so now how do you identify an RDA record? I think you all probably know this by now, right? RDA is no longer new. All of you have seen RDA records coming into your catalogs, I assume, probably for a couple of years now. But you're going to have the 040 field with a subfield E value RDA, and sometimes people forget to put it in, so there might be some confusion. That's one key that it's an RDA record, but remember that it might be missing for some reason. Also in the Leader 18, which is the descriptive cataloging form, in the US we're going to be mostly coding this value I, for ISBD punctuation is being included, which means that we're going to put the space between the place of publication and the name of the publisher, and a slash between the title proper and the statement of responsibility, and so on. Many systems around the world actually can supply that punctuation, and so the catalogers don't actually put that in. They just put the data into the MARC record in the subfields without the intermediate punctuation. And if they're doing that, they would put in the Leader 18 a blank or a value C. But in the US, we're going to be using I. So, and if you see a record that doesn't have the punctuation, but is you may need to alter it so that to follow ISBD punctuation. So here is a record out of the LC online catalog, just showing you an RDA record. You can see the 040 has the subfield E RDA, and what is labeled in this display as 000 are the leader values, but it's just a string of characters, so it's kind of hard to decipher what each of those values is. But you can see there is a value I in there, which is saying is ISBD punctuation. OCLC makes this much easier to see. So here is just the OCLC record. I think this is actually from Baker and Taylor, a vendor record in RDA. And you can see the subfield E RDA, and the value I from the leader is labeled in the fixed fields as description, DESC, in OCLC. I also want to point out that the subfield E in the O4O technically can come anywhere in that O4O, and it was appearing everywhere in the O4O, particularly during the beginning of RDA creation, record creation. The PCC has recommended that it come after the subfield B and before the subfield C. So that's where most libraries are now sticking it. It's valid in any place in that O4O string. Here's a change from AACR2 that actually doesn't have to do with RDA. It reflects a change in the ISBD, the International Standard Bibliographic Description. So we're going to now enclose each data element that needs square brackets in its own separate set of square brackets. So on a lot of these slides you'll see now I'm going to compare what you'd see in AACR2 with what you would do in RDA. So we would have one set of square brackets in the 260 field of the AACR2 record. The 260 has gone away and is now replaced in RDA by the 264 field, which we'll talk about later. But you can see that each one of these bits, if it needs to be bracketed because it's coming from outside the resource, then it would get its own set of square brackets. And you can see in the second example where we would have had SL and SN, which are Latin abbreviations, that RDA has done away with all Latin abbreviations, with the exception maybe of etc., and replaced them with English words or phrases to use instead. So for sine loco, no place, RDA says use place of publication not identified. That's a specific phrase we're told to use if we have to. And for sine nomine, no name of the publisher, we're going to say publisher not identified. There's another change that appears to be a change, but it turns out it's probably not going to be a change. So, particularly in an earlier version of this presentation, I made a little point to note that according to the instructions in the ISBD and RDA, it tells us to add a period at the end of certain elements, even if that element already ends in a period because it ends in an abbreviation. So for example, you see on this example, in the addition element, it's supposed to end in MARC. The addition element is supposed to end with a period. But some machines are told to supply a period in MARC at the end of certain fields because it's the end of a particular area in ISBD. And the machine doesn't know whether a period is an abbreviation or the end of an element. It's hard for that to know. So we were told that we were going to be doing things like you see here in the 250 with adding another period at the end of an abbreviation, and it looks really strange. There is now a Library of Congress PCC policy statement that says if either field 245 or 250 does not end in a period, add one. But the implication of that is if it does end in a period, don't add another one. So my take on this is actually, you don't have to do this double periods at the end of MARC fields where one period is sufficient to indicate that's the end. Finally, a bit about inaccuracies. RDA has a bunch of instructions to deal with what we call them typos, right? But they don't want to use that word, so they'll say inaccuracies. What to do? Remember, our principle is transcribe what you see. Represent the resource the way it actually appears. So in AACR2, we were told we would put bracketed corrections in the middle of the statement, the title statement, or some other statement. We're not allowed to do that in RDA. So RDA, as you can see in this instruction, says if it's a transcribed element, transcribe an inaccuracy or a misspelled word unless the instructions for a specific element indicate otherwise. For example, the exception at 2314. And at 2314, there is an exception for serials and integrating resources, which says that you can correct an obvious typo, because if it's in the first issue, it's very likely that they'll find out that they made a typo and they'll correct it, and that most of the future issues will have a correct title. So we want a record that is basically going to go on for a long time representing something to have the correct title. But for a book with a typo, it's unlikely to ever be corrected until you have a new edition. And so unless the publisher maybe issues something you can slap on, right? Sometimes they do send out something for you to paste in or something, but normally the typo is there forever. And for books, we're going to transcribe typos without a correction. And if it's important to note the typo and correct it, we do that in a different way. So here are some examples of that. In AACR2, we were told we have various techniques. One of those was to put in brackets IE, which is Latin for that is, and then the correction. So here the typo is the word legislative. It should be legislation. And then we would use this bracketed technique, and then we would add two different 246s according to the LCRI for that instruction, for that rule, to one with the typo and one with the correction. In RDA, we don't give any indication about the typo in the 245 field. We transcribe it as it appears, and then we can make a note and we can make an access point, added entry for the correction if it's important enough. And you can do that in one 246 field in this case. And RDA doesn't tell you what wording you put in your subfield I. One that people are using a lot is corrected title. Another one is title should appear as, or title appears misspelled. You know, title is misspelled and should be this. So that wording is not prescribed by RDA. So here, that was the IE method. In AACR2, we also had the bracket sick method, which was used in a different case. So that would indicate that that a particular word is misspelled. So everybody spot the typo in this title? Yeah, the word Egypt is spelled with a Q by mistake. I had to go down to government publications and verify it, and sure enough, it really was. So in AACR2, we would have put sick after Egypt, and then we would have made two 246s. In RDA, we're going to transcribe it with the typo, and then we're going to make a note and or an added entry, which we can do in one 246. In this case, instead of saying corrected title, I've used title should read. Now here's another one. Here's another interesting one. So on the title page, you see gems from the Holy Quran with a J. And then on the cover, you see gems from the Holy Quran with a G. So which one of these do you use in your 245? The preferred source, which if there is a title page, you're going to use the title page. So you're going to transcribe the title page with the typo spelled with a J. Then you have two options, really. So there's your 245. And you actually have two options in this case. Because the corrected spelling is on the cover, you could record the cover title in a 246 with the indicators 1 and 4. Or you could say 246 1 blank with a subfield I corrected title. Either way, either one of those would be correct. As I mentioned, for serials and integrating resources, there's no change in practice from AACR2. So if there are 3 O's in zoological, then your 245 for a serial, if this is a serial, will be corrected because it only was a typo probably on volume 1, number 1, and then they realized they made a typo. When they printed the next issue, they fixed it, or they fixed it a few issues later. You could give access to that misspelled title in the 246 field. Change from AACR2 has to do with transcription of marks of punctuation. Basically, AACR2 told us that if we had, the chief source had the punctuation marks ... or what we call ellipses, or square brackets, to replace the ... by a dash, which we couldn't do in OCLC, so we used 2 hyphens to make a dash. So we used hyphen. And then it also told us that if we had square brackets, to replace them with curved brackets or parentheses. So this is an example of that from AACR2. The title says if elected ... but in AACR2 we would have done if elected ... but in RDA we're transcribing punctuation as found. Just another example, this is a doctoral thesis in chemistry, and the title begins with square brackets around some numbers. So in AACR2 we would have had to change those to parentheses, but in RDA we'll record the square brackets, even though we know that square brackets usually mean that we're supplying something from outside the resource. But if the resource actually has square brackets, we'll use them. And then finally, there's one little change for title propers of serials. When you have something in the title that changes from issue to issue, or changes annually or every 4 years, we were told to omit that little bit of information and then replace it by the mark of omission, which was the ... unless it occurred at the beginning of the title, in which case we didn't give the mark of omission. The change here is that in RDA we're not told, we're not given that unless statement. So if you're omitting something that changes from issue to issue, even if it's at the beginning, we will include the mark of omission. So you can see the first 2 examples are no different in AACR2 or RDA, but the last one, if it said 2010 annual report, 2011 annual report, 2012 annual report, in AACR2 we would have just said annual report and dropped off the year in front of it. In RDA we would do ... annual report. Now, so we've looked at title propers, and now we have I'm going through this, if you haven't figured out, in kind of area order, and then in AACR2. And then within areas, those are sort of the sub-parts of the rules in that particular part of AACR2. So after the title proper in AACR2, we had the GMD, right? The General Material Designation, which we only used for certain types of resources. We never used them for books, although other countries sometimes did use them, and you could record the word text in brackets. But we decided we'd only use it for certain types of resources. That has gone away in RDA. There is no GMD. We will not be using the 245 subfield H anymore in an RDA record. And in a few years' time, they will all disappear out of OCLC. And then we'll have to figure out if we're going to make them all disappear out of our local catalogs, and how we'll do that. These are being replaced by 3 different elements, one of which is called content type, which is covered in RDA 6.9 and has a new MARC field, MARC 336. The second one is called media type, which is in RDA 3.2 and has a MARC tag now 337. And then we have carrier type, which is RDA 3.3 and MARC field 338. So the content type, so they decided that the GMDs were kind of a mishmash of all sorts of things, and they weren't all that helpful necessarily, because if you had a score, electronic score, the GMD that you used was electronic resource, and there was no indication that what you had was music. Or if you had an online video, you didn't use bracket video recording, you used bracket electronic resource. What they've tried to do is analyze all the various things that we catalog and fit them into categories that we can really clearly label what they are. And these are broken down into these three things. So content type is the form of communication through which a work is expressed. So an example, there's a list. It's actually a controlled list in RDA 6.9. Some examples of that are perform music, text, two-dimensional moving image, also three-dimensional moving image if you have Avatar, or I'm going to see Gravity soon, hopefully in 3D. Media type then is the general type of intermediation device required to view, play, run, etc. the content of a resource. So an example of a media type would be audio. And these again are lists of terms. You don't make them up. There are lists in RDA. You pick the right ones. Audio, computer, microform, unmediated. What would be an example of something that's unmediated? A book. Except that I have a mediation device on my face. Because I cannot read a book without my mediation device. But the books are considered unmediated. Video is another example. And then the carrier type is the format of the storage medium and housing of a carrier. So for example, audio can appear on multiple types of carriers. So one particular type of audio carrier is audio disc. One particular type of computer type is that it's an online resource. Another type would be computer disk or computer. There's a whole bunch of terms in RDA. Some other examples of computer carriers: computer disk cartridge, computer tape cartridge, computer tape reel, etc. I mean, there's a whole list of terms. An example of a microform carrier is microfiche, or microfilm, or micro-opaque. There's a whole bunch of them. For unmediated, an example for a book is the carrier is a volume, but another possible is sheet. Or, let me look at the others that I have here. Flip chart, or object, or roll, or card. So we have card, flip chart, object, roll, sheet, and volume. For a book, you're going to use volume. But if it's a single sheet, and there are broadsides and things like that, that's something special collections collects. And sometimes you get government documents that are on a single sheet. I know we have lots of those in our library. You would say sheet or something else. So here's an example of the GMD showing the GMD being replaced. So here's an electronic book. We would have used the subfield H electronic resource in the 245 subfield H. There will be nothing in the 245 now that indicates the electronicness of this. Instead, we have those three fields: content type, media type, and carrier type, and there are two subfields within each of those, one of which you can record the controlled term, or there's also a code in MARC for that term. And either one is valid. And then there's a subfield 2 where you say where that controlled vocabulary came out of. Now, if you're using OCLC, you don't have to look any of this up, because there's a wonderful macro in OCLC that enables you to just click a button, and it brings up a little pull-down menu. And actually, if you have a 300 field and the fixed field's already coded, it will actually suggest the terms that you need. And I've never had it done, given me the wrong values. So it will, scores, okay, I haven't done this catalog to score. So it will tell you, and you can change it if it's wrong, but it brings up a screen with the values and you click OK. And if you don't like the values it's suggesting, you can just use a pull down and choose the correct ones. So you don't actually have to type these in. Having to type in two-dimensional moving image every time you catalog a video is likely to result in many typos. Even having it on a button somewhere where you would like use the text and just plunk it in would be good, but this macro is really very helpful. And if you don't know how to use macros in OCLC connection, ask your colleagues who do, because they'll show you how to. You can actually put a button on your at the top of your OCLC connection screen where you just click on that button and it runs the macro without you having to go through a whole bunch of menu choices, and it just picks the macro. Here's where we're going to see something different, because this is an example of a book. And we didn't use a GMD for a book, but we will always use the content type, media type, and carrier types for all resources in RDA. So we didn't say text in the 245, but you do have these three fields in RDA records that say it's text unmediated and that it's a volume. The idea is behind these is not necessarily that you'll display these to your users. In my library, before we migrated to our new system, we decided we were not going to display them. The idea was that these terms could be used by the systems behind the scenes either to generate icons or to do user limits in some way. So, you know, it's worth asking your vendors what use are they going to, are they making use of it now, are they going to, what are their plans, and make them aware of these values. There is a lot of repetition with the fixed field coding as well. So a lot of the systems that we have use the fixed field coding for this. And I think in MARC, they've managed to make everything, have codes for everything that now has terms as well. These fields are repeatable. So if you have a resource that has multiple characteristics, you can repeat the fields. So here, if you're cataloging a website, and the website has maps, texts, and photographs, your 300 will say one online resource, and you can have 3 content types for text, cartographic, image, and still image. Even though there's only one media type, which is computer, and one carrier type, which is online resource. Subfields A and B are repeatable. So some catalogers may decide to use one 336 field in this example with repeatable subfield A. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, that is perfectly valid in MARC. And the Library of Congress has said they don't want their catalogers doing this. They'd rather have the separate fields. But if they get copy coming in that has this, they will accept it and not replace it with 3 separate fields. In addition to being repeatable, there's a subfield 3 that allows us to specify particular parts of a resource that the data are applicable to. So for example, if you're cataloging a book that has an accompanying CD of a lecture or whatever. But let's just say it's an accompanying CD of a lecture that goes with the book. So the book is textual, but the CD is spoken word. That's the control term for that. So you can use a subfield 3 in front of the subfield A and B to say what part of the resource this particular data applies to. And this is not controlled vocabulary, so you can use whatever fits. So you could say subfield 3 value is book, and that's text, and subfield 3 is CD, and that's spoken word. And you can see it's repeated throughout each of these 3x fields. Now this is not required, but the use of the subfield 3 is optional. Okay, so no more GMD. 5 minutes, okay. Parallel titles. There's a little change in parallel titles from ACR2 to RDA. In ACR2, parallel titles had to come from the same source as the title proper. And if they came from anywhere else in the book or other resource, we couldn't put them in the 245. We had to make a note and an added entry. In RDA, parallel titles are simply defined as the title proper in another language and/or script, but there's no restriction on the sources of this information. So you can take parallel titles from anywhere in the resource. So here's an example where we have an English Loud dictionary. The parallel title only appeared on the cover. And so in ACR2, we had a 245 with just the English title, and we had to do a 246.1 with a note. In RDA, we can take all the parallel titles and put them into the 245. We separate them by equal signs. That's an ISBD punctuation. And we don't have to indicate that the Lao title for this dictionary came off the cover. We don't have to say anything about that. More complicated example, just of parallel titles. ACR2 had 3 levels of description. Anybody remember that? First level, second level, and third level of description. Third level of description was everything, including the kitchen sink, right? You throw in everything you have. However, Library of Congress decided many, many years ago that it was too expensive to do everything. So for parallel titles, they said we're going to follow second level description. And the second level description was you would only give the very first parallel title. No matter how many there were, you would only give the very first one. And if there were any that were subsequent that were in English, they would give that as well. But what that meant was if you had a resource, like you see in this example here, in 4 languages, you would only get necessarily a subset of those. And so if a user searched for the Spanish title of this dictionary, they would think you didn't own it, even if you did. Because all we would have had was the English title and the very first parallel title, which was in French. And we would have skipped the Russian and the Spanish, because most libraries would have followed Library of Congress's lead in doing a second level description. There's no such concept in RDA of these levels of description. There are core elements, and then there are optional elements. Now, parallel title is not a core element, so it is not required to record any parallel title. However, Library of Congress has made parallel title a core element. And so they will now be recording all the parallel titles, which is a better user service. Because if a user comes to your catalog looking for the Spanish title, because that's the one they got a citation for, they will find that you own this resource. And finally, one more, even more extreme example, but extreme but not uncommon, particularly if you're looking at international documents from the United Nations. So here we've got Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. And you can see the very brief display that you would have had in ACR2 if you'd been able to transcribe Arabic to begin with. But you would have had just Arabic and Chinese and English in this case, because LC's policy would have been the first parallel title, which would have been Chinese, and any subsequent one that's in English. So you would have gotten the English in there. But in RDA, assuming you can transcribe all these scripts, you would have all of these titles and access points for all of them. Okay, there's not a lot of change. Not a lot of change in other title information. Basically, other title, we commonly call that subtitles. It's not a core element in RDA, but Library of Congress, very sensibly, to my mind, has made it a core element. So, I mean, imagine if you decided not to record the subtitles of most books. We would really be losing a lot of information. Even RDA does not require us to record that. So that is a particular case where you, as an institution, may decide, I'm going to follow LC and make it a core element, or I'm going to say for my library, other title information is core element, and I will always record it, at least maybe for monographs. For serials, you might have a different practice because the subtitle may change from issue to issue or from year to year, and you might decide not to record that. One last little bit about other title information, and then we'll stop for our break. There was a place in ACR2 where we were allowed to supply other title information. And this goes against the principle of transcription about what appears on the resource, right? So AACR2 said if you had the title and it was the name of the book was the title of a corporate body, or the name of a person, then you should supply something in brackets as the other title to explain that. So for example, the title is Workshop on Rebuilding Abalone Stocks in British Columbia. Well, what is that? Is it the proceedings of the workshop? Is it the program for the workshop? Is it the list of attendees? It could be any of those things. So ACR2 said supply an explanation. The same thing in your second example where you have a film festival program. Or the selections of an author's writings. Without the addition of the word selections, ACR2, it could be a biography, right? Or it could be something else. Now, in RDA, we're going to transcribe those, and we're not allowed to supply that explanation as other title information. So if we need to do that, we simply add it in a note or some other place. Now, of course, there are going to be subject headings that say something is a biography. So that's available there. There's fixed field coding that says something is a biography. For proceedings of a conference, you probably want to make a note that it's proceedings of a workshop or that it's a program for a particular event. There are one exception, two exceptions where RDA still allows us to transcribe other information. And those are for cartographic and moving image resources. Very many times you'll have a map that doesn't say where the map covers, the place in the world the map covers. And RDA, the people who wrote RDA decided that this was still important information that the cartographic community really needed to know in the title and statement of responsibility area what part of the world the map was depicting. So they're still allowing map catalogers to add the name of the place in other title. And for motion pictures, they're still allowing us to add, if all we have is a trailer for the motion picture, then we can supply other title information for that as well. I think